Hey guys, Jake Carlson here, host of the Modern Leadership Podcast. Are you ready to focus on amplifying your leadership superpowers? Let's go! Good morning, my friends and fellow elite achievers. Welcome to Modern Leadership, the podcast where each week we sit down with authors, entrepreneurs, and leaders to explore their journey, diving into the ups, their downs, and ultimately the lessons they learned along the way. Our goal, of course, is to show that everything is figure-outable. And today's guest expert is Valerio Pascotto. Valerio is the co-founder of IGEOS, which he built together with Tim Gallwey, author of Inner Game of Tennis and other inner game books. IGEOS serves as a resource for global business leaders to strengthen their team's passion for excellence and create a workplace consonant with human values. Valerio is also a senior partner at Illustra, where he leads his team in designing and delivering workshops and coaching for leadership performance optimization. Valerio has a doctoral degree in psychology from Pepperdine University. He's a licensed psychologist practicing in marriage, family, and child counseling. He is also an official member of the Forbes Coaching Council, inspiring readers around the world through articles on change management, team building, and leadership performance. Valerio, it's so great to have you with us today. How are you?
I am doing really well, and it's really a pleasure and honor to be with you today, Jake.
Well, I have so many questions because your background, the things that you have been a part of and the things that you're a part of today are just world changing. I mean, you're changing the lives of a lot of people. And I got to ask you, take us back to the days of college, the days when you were kind of aspiring to be in a career. What was going on in your mind? What were you looking forward to in a career at that time?
I was totally in the dark about career. I went to law school because my father was a lawyer, but didn't last long. I am a child of the 60s, so I went through that period as well. And if I had to be sort of honest, I would say that a core thread throughout my adolescence and then growing up was getting a better understanding on human dynamics. I suspect because I was pretty bad at it. That was definitely something that attracted me to try and understand what allowed for positive outcomes in connecting with each other and what stood in the way of those positive outcomes.
I understand that you have your doctoral degree from Pepperdine. Where else have you done your education? Has it all been in California?
It has been mostly. I certainly did high school and undergraduate in Rome, Italy. And in undergraduate, shifting from law all the way to Indian philosophy and spiritualism. And then I came to California much later and decided to go back to school and got my master's degree first at Pepperdine. And they had just launched a program that was called a PsyD, a doctor in psychology, which was a very clinical program. And I just went along and entered that program and enjoyed that very much, and then got my licenses and practiced for quite a few years clinical psychology and reoriented myself towards organizations and people working in organizations as being my greatest interest.
And many of our listeners are familiar with The Inner Game of Tennis, obviously a very popular book, and Tim Gallwey. And tell me, how did that relationship begin, and how did you get connected with him and then create this company, IGEOS?
It started with friendship. We kind of were in similar circles, and we bumped into each other. We shared interests. We became friends. Then around 1995, we got an opportunity to collaborate on building a team training boot camp that would highlight the magic of teams and also the downside of teams. And so we worked together designing this for a couple of years. We piloted it, we tested it, and then we delivered it together to thousands of people. And that's how we created IGEOS, it coming from this collaboration of inner game and what I brought as well in terms of my own thinking. And that's what we have been doing together mostly. It's this team training approach that we have and the impact that it has on participants to see what is incredibly possible in teams, but also how difficult it can be.
Yeah, and you're looking at starting this back in the mid 90s. And I would imagine that currently, in today's day and age, there's a lot of interest in these team building workshops, team building, collaborating workshops or trainings and that kind of stuff. But in 95, were you guys a little bit ahead of the curve there? Was that kind of pushing a boulder uphill, trying to convince and get people to buy into your idea?
Definitely more challenging. They were outfits already out there, the high and low rope courses, but we were very different. We were not into this idea of a perception of risk and camaraderie built around risk. We were much more interested in what happens. And so we created a simulator. Really, that's what it is. If you're a pilot, you can appreciate the power of a simulator. It mimics real life. It mimics flying the plane. It mimics being in a team, but it has no consequences if the situation deteriorates tremendously. So we created a simulator where people could come and practice working in teams and see what made the difference positively and what made the difference negatively.
And so what are you spending most of your time doing today? I mean, I know you're a part of IGEOS, you're a part of Illustra, you're also a licensed psychologist. Where do you find yourself spending most of your time today?
Still working with individuals who have an influencing opportunity in the workplace. I think what has slightly changed is that we are much more outspoken now than we were in the mid-90s, that business can be a force for good, and it could make a huge difference in terms of our survival as a species. And there is no real either or. A business can still be profitable while it is also addressing people and planet and wanting to make a positive difference for people and planet.
So take us through a little bit of that discussion as if we, the listeners, are part of your program and we're learning about what you're training. Take us through this idea of how, person and planet and all of that can weave in and out of the organizations that we work for.
It starts with the obvious that you pointed out already. Today, we are very clear that no work can be accomplished without collaboration. It's just way too complex. So we do need to have the capacity to cooperate, collaborate. And immediately there is a first reckoning, which is mindset. What is my default mindset? And more often than not, I would say almost always, we notice that the primary default mindset is what's in it for me. Now, unfortunately, that individual mindset doesn't play out in teams. So the wonderful opportunity and challenge is to shift from a mindset that is concerned about what's in it for me to a mindset that feels privileged and honored that I can make a difference in a team. Carol Dweck would probably call it a growth mindset as opposed to a fixed mindset. Amy Edmondson would call it probably collective intelligence and teaming and psychologically safe environment. But fundamentally, that's what my interest is in helping through curiosity, not through prescription, through curiosity, through thought-provoking questions, helping increase that awareness of a team mindset versus an individual mindset.
Yeah, and let's walk through a couple of these questions because the thing you're talking about is absolutely so critical right now. I do a lot of coaching, and I have a number of people that come to me with this same challenge that you're talking about. They hire good people, but those good people are what's in it for me. And at the end of the day, they kind of punch their clock and they leave and they don't think about their business. And I was on the phone earlier today with somebody who had said, here's the challenge, right? I go out of the office to do work. I have other things that I'm doing. And as soon as I walk out the door, the phones come out, the Facebook turns on, the chit chat by the water cooler happens. And I think that's all part and parcel to this idea of what's in it for me. How do we start breaking that down through some of this curiosity questioning that you talk about?
It has to be an inner thirst. In other words, lecturing, teaching, instructing does not work. So what works in terms of moving my mindset from what's in it for me to team? Well, Adam Grant did fantastic work in looking at a giver style versus a taker style, and even quantifying that the giver style is 300 times more productive than a taker style. So what would move me into a giver style? You could say it's the same mechanism of interest. I realize that I can have a lot more enjoyment, a lot more value, a lot more impact if I move into a giver style. The second one is taste. In my experience, the greatest, most extraordinary feeling, a gift almost, is when I feel appreciation. I don't think there's anything greater than feeling grateful and appreciative and not having to wait that somebody says, Valerio, you've got 1 week left to live to feel appreciative about life, but just feel appreciation. And I cannot feel appreciation when I am in a what's in it for me mindset. I am closing down, I'm grabbing, I'm wondering, how can I be perceived more valuable than you? What is threatening me? It's much closer to the reptilian brain and to the fear response than it is to the frontal lobes and to creativity and enjoyment. So I think that the provocative question helped the person reach his or her own conclusion that indeed investing and practicing a team mindset is much more rewarding.
Do you find that there are different motivations for the what's in it for me? As you were talking through that, the idea that came through my mind is some people go in with a what's in it for me as an arrogance, as a, I deserve all of this and I should receive this. Others, I think, as you were talking, go into it and say, what's in it for me in more of a protective, if I don't get my piece, I'm not going to get anything, almost a defensive versus an offensive when it comes to this idea of what's in it for me. Do you see any difference between those two?
Interesting, because you brought up two critical aspects, offensive or defensive. Well, those are the two responses of fear, either fight or flight. So you could say that the common denominator is still fear. It's just expressed in two different ways. And that's been my experience when I see a bully, when I see somebody that seems to have to be the center of attention. Usually you dig a little bit and there's a very, very insecure person.
And so is part of the breaking down this what's in it for me also a building up of confidence within that person?
Absolutely. In fact, I would say that one of the things that I'm most interested in is noticing and appreciating your strength, not addressing your weakness. My default would be to address weakness. That's my default, because somehow I grew up with that message that if you have a weakness, you have to strengthen it. Now, that message is very misleading because it assumes that I'm God. In other words, I can reach perfection. I eliminate all my weaknesses and I'm perfect. The reality is that that's not the case. And there's a lot more esteem building, a lot more confidence when I work with strength.
This is an interesting topic, and I've seen, in the leadership world, this transition from, previously we were all about like send people to training, send people to different places on your team so that they could overcome some of their weaknesses or get better at the things that they weren't good at. And now I look at kind of, my wife's a school teacher, And in her school, they have this positive reinforcement as opposed to criticism and punishment, where you help people understand that they're doing this well, and that reinforces that behavior. I wanted to ask you a little bit about this. What's in it for me? Do you see any difference between the generations, as say baby boomers, Gen X, or millennials in the workforce? Do you see any difference in the what's in it for me mindset?
Well, it's a very interesting question. And going back also to what you were mentioning earlier, I would say there's a distinction between skill building and weakness. In other words, it's a definition. I can define my need to acquire a skill as skill building, or I can define my need to acquire a skill as negative. I should already have it, and therefore it's a weakness. And it's all about how we define things. So the second question of have I seen a shift, let's say, in the millennials versus my generation? Certainly, there's a lot that is being said that to retain millennials, you do need to have a conversation above and beyond profit, a lot more associated with purpose. You certainly have a Daniel Pink that has said that those intrinsic motivators are critical and extrinsic ones don't work. But if I have to be honest, when I was 16, I was asking the same question. What's my purpose? What's my value? What should I do differently? And then entering into my late teens and early 20s, the rebellion of I'm not going to be part of this machinery that couldn't care less about why it's doing what it's doing. I want to stay conscious. I want to make deliberate choices. And I don't see very much of a difference. Maybe later in my 30s and 40s, I might have felt a little bit more the weight of responsibility and started being a little bit more cautious and a little bit more maybe risk adverse, but certainly not in my teens and 20s.
Yeah, I think it's very fascinating, this conversation. I did a presentation on different generations in the workforce, and I did some quotes where I asked, certain things. I'd say, who do you think we were talking about? And they were headlines from newspapers. And it was interesting because everybody would raise their hand and say, oh, you're talking about millennials. Oh, you're talking about millennials. And then I would say, oh, no, this was from Time Magazine in 1990, or this was from New York Times in 1940. It seems like in every generation, we have these periods of time where we say, oh, it's them, not us. And so I think it's a fascinating conversation.
So we need a time machine and go 30 years when they are in their 50s and 60s and see what's going on then, because that might be a factor. The good news is that they are inspirational, though, that the fact that they are refusing to engage in a rote manner is really very inspiring.
Well, and they're pushing different generations to change and think differently as well. And I think sometimes that uncomfortability creates action. And unfortunately, when we get comfortable, we get into routine. And when we get into routine, there's no progress. But when we're uncomfortable, it forces action. It's like having a rock in your shoe. It forces you to sit down, take off the shoe, and get that rock out. And sometimes when we have these uncomfortabilities between generations within the workforce, it forces us to sit down and figure out where we need to put that rock to make sure that we can move forward and not have any problems.
And that's one way of redefining and feeling appreciation. I can go to a millennial now and say, thank you. Thank you for creating this turmoil, because you are allowing me to rethink and reconsider and become more conscious.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned something a little bit earlier that I thought was interesting, and that is this idea of training for skills. And it reminded me that one of my philosophies of hiring in HR is to hire for character and train for skills. That character is very difficult to change, but skills can be taught, they can be learned, as long as somebody has the passion, the desire to work on that. So talk to me a little bit about this idea of the character of somebody versus the skills that they bring to the table.
I would have to agree. I perhaps would not call it character, because, there's a bias a little bit, the attributional bias. When somebody does something, it's easier to see it as character. When I do it, it's easier to see it as context-driven and situational-driven. But if we talk about mindset, if we talk about attitude, I would have to say it's paramount. It's paramount to pay attention to what attitude I bring, because if that attitude is in the what's in it for me, it's going to generate consequences that are going to have an impact. And if the culture is trying to move towards a sense of making a difference, of taking the responsibility of doing good, a psychological safety so that innovation and creativity can become a daily factor, if all that is the desired culture, then at the very minimum, we need a very strong coaching arm to work with those that are struggling.
And I love this idea of talking about coaching and the necessity that coaching plays in leadership and development of talent. But I want to target you and talk a little bit about accountability. And we hear a lot today about, KPIs and key performance indicators, or OKRs, objectives and key results. And I want to talk a little bit about the role that accountability plays in creating a workplace that is thriving, that's growing, that's successful, if you want to define it as the word success.
That's a fascinating question, because when I was thinking of the qualities of leadership, I had highlighted accountability. Now, in English, it's easier to do and might be more difficult in a other language. But in English, accountability translates into ability to count, ability to make a difference. So is that the culture of accountability that I want to create versus, Valerio, do you mind coming in my office? I really would like to talk to you about your accountability on Project X, where immediately my sense is, I'm going to be blamed. Now, counter to that, I walk into a room, nobody realizes I walked in, and I hear you speak to somebody else and say, that guy Valerio, you can really count on him. That accountability I want.
Yeah, of course.
So how can we create a culture where accountability is the opportunity that I have to show up, make a difference, and be counted on, as opposed to the opportunity to be blamed?
This is a great light bulb moment for me. And I love when we're on the podcast and I have light bulb moments, because in all my years of leadership coaching and talking and reading and studying, I've never really put it together like that. Accountability is the ability to be counted on. And somebody can count on me. That means, accountability is all about accomplishing what you set out to do, and not just in your own eyes and in your own view of the world, but also, what the company is relying on you. It's this trustworthiness, or worthy of trust, is it not?
Yes, absolutely. And it changes. So just today I had an example. I'm working with a team. It's not my role. I have nothing to do with the logistics. But today I floated a question. If we had to cancel a workshop, what are the contract terms? And I got a reply, today is the last day. So, of course, here's the other side. I immediately gloated on what I had done to surface it and why nobody else had, which is the wrong side of accountability. And that's the default that I need to be aware of and recognize in me. However, the initial desire to check came from a very different accountability, one of wanting to make sure that the team had the best possible chance of succeeding and that there would be no negative consequences. So it came from a very good place. Later, it went into this other place of, look at me, how good I am, and did I not save everybody's neck? And that's the unfortunate side, but practice can, at least as we call it in our work, Tim and I, that awareness is 85% of the game, and the rest is practice. So I noticed that I gloated a little bit, and I filed it away. But the initial aspect of wanting to check, which has nothing to do with my role and responsibility, came from the original definition of accountability, wanting to make a difference, wanting to count.
Yeah, what a terrific kind of synopsis and discussion about this. Valeria, I love your background, your experience, the things that you're teaching. I think you're making a huge impact. I'd love to go deeper into this, but alas, we're running a little bit short on our episode time here, and it's time now for us to shift gears and go to a section I call Learning from Leaders, where we find out a little bit more about you. How does that sound?
Sounds wonderful.
All right. So we talked before we hit record, and you were ready to talk about music and movies. And I want to make sure that we have a chance to jump into that, because if there's two things I love, it's music and movies. So tell us a little bit about what you were thinking movie and music wise.
Well, music, I would say two significant, and this is going to say probably a lot about me. One is Pink Floyd, and the reason why I picked them is because they were a band that I heard in concert in 1970. And I thought that they were playing an incredible piece of music, and then my friend said, no, they're just tuning their instruments.
Now, being from Rome, I have to ask you, have you gone down to Pompeii and gone into the Pink Floyd museum display they have down there?
No, I haven't. No, and it was in Rome that the concert took place, but no, I haven't gone to Pompeii, although it's pretty close.
Yeah, when we were in Rome last year, we went down to Pompeii and we were walking around, and they have a Colosseum there like they do in Rome, in Pompeii, that they've uncovered. And of course, Pink Floyd back in the 60s played a concert called Live in Pompeii and Live in Pompeii 2. And within the corridors of the Colosseum down there, they have set up pictures and they have televisions of the concert and they have the music playing in the hallways. And it's, as a Pink Floyd fan myself, it is an absolutely terrific experience. You'll have to do it next time you're visiting.
I will definitely do that. I'm writing it down as we speak.
All right, so Pink Floyd's number one. What was number two?
King Crimson.
Oh, that's not what I'm familiar with.
Yeah, the piece that comes to my mind the most is In the Wake of Poseidon, and it could be because of the Greek god, but it's a pretty amazing, very unknown group to some extent, but very, very different. Maybe similar to Pink Floyd in some aspects.
Well, then I'll have to check it out. As a Pink Floyd fan, I'll have to do that. How about movies?
Absolutely Easy Rider. I saw it when it came out in New York. I think I was probably 18 or 19. And then the other one that really had an impact was One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Oh, yes. A great book.
Yes, and a great movie too. But it hit home because it was kind of in the area of interest of my life, psychology, and it really made quite an impression.
Yeah, I can imagine. All right, how about the book that you're currently reading? What's on your Kindle or bedside table?
I just finished a wonderful book by Amy Edmondson called The Fearless Organization.
And what did you like about it?
She has a tremendous ability not only to research, but to combine research with a very lucid and clear narrative. And she had written many books. I had picked up Teaming because it was so closely connected to my sphere of interest. And then when I knew that this book was coming out in February, I immediately picked it up. And it's all about psychological safety. I found out that actually she coined that term 20 years ago.
The psychological safety.
Safety, yes. That then Google picked up in their research on teams. And she now revisits very much the psychological safety and the impact that it has. And her examples are quite startling. The measure of psychological safety probably is the willingness of participants to speak up and to do so without fear of retribution and without first really concern that if the idea is off, they will be criticized.
And the impact that has on creativity and innovation within a company context.
Yes, absolutely. And when you are in businesses that have significant outcome, like the airline industry, deadly. One example that she offers is the worst aviation history accident of all times that happened in Tenerife, I think, over 30 years ago. And the casualty was over 500 people.
And it was all because the co-pilot didn't feel that he could speak up in the situation.
Correct. He did say, can we check? But it was in a very subservient, asking permission from the captain. Can we check with the tower? The captain said, no, I know exactly that we are on the right runway and I don't want to waste my time. Let's go. And the pilot went silent. So a lot of the book is not only on speaking up, but on listening up too. What precluded the captain, I'm sure, a few milliseconds before crashing, probably had the thought, I wish I had heard my co-pilot.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, I should have listened. Shoulda, woulda, coulda.
So it is not only speaking up, but also listening up, because it's very easy to listen to respond rather than listen to understand.
Now, I know that you took some time earlier today and went through the Leadership Superpower Assessment found on jkcarlson.com and came up with your leadership superpower, and share that with us.
Yes, it came up as influencing. And I am very happy with that, particularly in my sense of influencing. Oftentimes, when a person says, I wish I could influence more, they are thinking about how can I get you to buy into my idea. While I would like to think of influencing much more if I asked you, Jake, tell me about the person that most influenced your life positively.
Zig Ziglar.
And now you're flooded with what kind of feelings and what kind of thoughts?
Positive.
Positive, yes. Did not try to get you to buy into his point of view, acted in a way through what he did, through his actions, to allow you to grow and to manifest your potential and to be the best that you can be. And that's the influencing that I aspire to, not becoming very good at convincing. And I was told years ago that I am very good at convincing, but in a negative thing. This person stood up and said, Valerio, I'd like to say something, but I don't want you to respond because you're so good with words and you can prove to me that what I'm going to say is wrong. So I don't want you to respond, but this is what I want to say. I came here full of hope and now I'm filled with despair. So that was like, wow, I don't want to influence that way, even if I get a compliment that I'm so good at convincing people.
There's a difference between convincing and influencing.
Yes, there is, yes.
Very good.
Sometimes it's a fine line, but there is. And if I think of influencing as simply what part can I play on helping you maximize your potential and go even above and beyond whatever limits you might think you have, that's the kind of influencing that I would like to be able to embrace.
What a great response. All right, our next question is a motivational quote, philosophy, or mantra, something that you live by.
I actually have it on the website, on the IGEOS.net, and it comes from Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, and he says, if you want to build ship, don't drum up people together to collect wood, and don't assign them tasks and work, but rather teach them to long for the endless immensity of the sea.
The power of that. And we're talking mindset a lot in this podcast, and that's really about the mindset of you and your team, right?
Yes, absolutely, yes.
Very cool. All right, our last question then is the book that you most often gift or refer to friends, family, and colleagues.
I would say a few, but definitely I would refer Amy's books, both the Teaming and the Fearless Organization. I definitely refer a lot to Adam Grant with this idea of givers. And Daniel Pink, although Tim and I talking about it, said, Daniel Pink just wrote about what everybody was already working on 30 years ago, this idea that carrot and stick doesn't work very well. But I have to give him a lot of credit for having put it down beautifully and succinctly in his book. So definitely I would recommend reading his book as well.
Yeah, all of those are great books. We've read them all and we've talked about them on this podcast. So thank you so much for sharing those with us. Before we let you go, how can we find out more about you? And of course, drop by the IGEOS website.
I would say that probably the IGEOS website is the best place. And also take a look at we have a section called the IGEOS show. And we have interviewed some thought leaders in the area of making a positive difference in the world. And maybe there's one or two. Amy Edmondson is there as well. And maybe there's one or two that the readers would enjoy listening to.
Oh, very cool. We'll link all of that up on the show notes for this episode. Again, thank you for coming on the show. Thank you for being this week's Modern Leadership Guest Expert.
Thank you, Jake. It was a real honor and privilege to be on your show. Thank you so much.
All right, my friends, what did you think? I mean, we were speaking the same language, right? I mean, he likes Pink Floyd. He likes leadership. He talks about influence. I felt like I was talking to a wiser, more sophisticated version of myself there. I can aspire to be a leader like Valerio, and I thank him again for coming on the show. So much to take away, so much to dissect. Go to the show notes, check it all out there. We'll link it all up, jakeacarlson.com/ML 152. And you know what? I want to wish you a happy holiday. I don't know what holiday you're celebrating at this time, whether it's Christmas, Hanukkah, whether it's any other holiday. I just hope that you and your family are having a great day, a great week. Thank you for joining us on the podcast. And of course, until next week, wish you the very best of days, an even better life. And remember, everything is figure-outable. Thanks for listening to the Modern Leadership Podcast. You can find me on Facebook at Speaker Jake, on Twitter at Jake A. Carlson, and of course the website, jakeacarlson.com. See you there.